Hi, everybody. Welcome to today's Tuesday topic. Today's topic is ethically speaking, the case study on the role of the mentor. Today with our case study discussion leaders, we have Dr. Roseanne DiMaria Galili, Zach Hathaway, and Connie Perry. So now without further ado, let me throw it over to you, Dr. DiMaria, and get us started.
Great. Well, welcome everybody, and thank you for joining us. And today we're going to be talking about the role of the mentor. And Darren, can you go to the next slide, please? And so I just want to, there's some new faces here. So this series is really to address responsible conduct of research. It's sometimes used interchangeably with research integrity. And here in this program, we are really focusing on really supporting the NIH's mission to continue to engage individuals with RCR training at every stage of their career. Next slide, please. Next slide. So we're just going to go through this quickly. So what do we cover in this series? We do meet every quarter. Today we're talking about mentor-mentee responsibilities and relationships in terms of RCR. In the spring, we're going to be talking about peer review. In the summer, we'll be talking about research misconduct and policies for handling misconduct. And you could see then in the fall, we have data acquisitions, conflict of interest, responsible authorship and publication, and it goes on and on. So we have, the next 2 years planned out. And if anybody would like to be a presenter at one of these upcoming sessions, please reach out to Darren or myself, and we will work with you. Thank you. So next slide. So today we're going to really talk about mentoring. And I thought it was really nice to really think and reflect upon the history of mentoring. So if you want to know where the word mentor came from, it's really from Greek mythology, from Telemachus and the mentor. So in Greek mythology, Odysseus of Ithaca went to fight in the Trojan War, and he entrusted the care of his son, Telemachus, to an older and wiser friend, Mentor. So Telemachus and Mentor developed a strong relationship built on the foundations of guidance and support. And hence, here is where the word mentor comes from. And mentor has, over the years, become synonymous with teacher, counselor, coach, facilitator, motivator, and friend. Next slide, please. So what about the mentor, the mentee, and scientific research? So if we think about this in terms of research, the mentor provides guidance in one or more areas that includes intellectual development and academics, technical expertise, and ethical responsibilities and behavior. And the mentee is the person who's receiving the mentoring, the person who is advised, trained, or counseled by a mentor. And today we're going to be spending a lot of time talking about what are the ethical responsibilities in terms of research in this mentoring relationship. Next slide, please. Okay, so some of our data sources for this presentation is from the NIH's guide on mentoring and training. And so when we think about mentor-mentee training, these are the main areas we should be focusing on: scientific investigation, communication, personal interactions, career planning, and scientific responsibility. Next slide. And the mentor is responsible really for providing guidelines for mentors, providing guidelines for their mentees with information about expectations of availability and professional development. And mentors should be readily available to answer questions, respond within 24 hours, and meet at least once every 2 weeks, work closely with their mentees to prepare oral presentations, papers, and abstracts, advise their trainees on best practices for presenting research, and introduce their trainees to important contributors, right? And to provide oral and written assessment of progress, strengths, and areas for improvement annually. And when we think about this training, what is the role of the trainee? or the mentee? Well, they need to have a commitment to the work of the lab or their institute center and their research goals. So this is, about responsibility. The trainees need to be responsible. They need to recognize that much of science today involves a team effort and collaboration. So they need to really think about interpersonal interactions and civility. And they need to identify one or more mentors in addition to their immediate supervisor. And this is really important because, it takes a village to raise a child, and it takes a village to raise a scientist. So you want to really have your professional networking available. And, it's really important for the mentee to be aware of legal and ethical aspects underlying research, and that's about integrity. And they need to really communicate positively with their mentor, what works for them, what doesn't work for them, and, communicate clearly and often, right? So that's really critical. Next slide. And, but I think what's really important, we've heard that a lot, what does a mentor need? What does a mentee do in terms of research? But I think we don't really hear a lot about how to mentor ethically. And this is a great author, Brad Johnson, who's written a lot on being a mentor, a guide for higher education faculty. And before the Zoom started, Connie and I were trying to, we know we have a copy of this, but in the move, neither one of us can find our handbook of it. So, but this is a really great book especially for faculty that are just starting out. And the library does have copies in the library. So what does Dr. Johnson here say? He came up with this, what we call mentoring code of ethics. And these are his guiding ethical principles for mentoring. Beneficence. So in terms of beneficence, we should be promoting the mentee's best interests whenever possible. In terms of non-maleficence, we should be avoiding harm to the mentees. In terms of neglect, abandonment, exploitation, or boundary violations. And this is really critical.
Yeah.
And, kind of jump in anytime you want.
I completely agree.
Autonomy is about working to strengthen mentee independence and maturity. Next slide. Fidelity is about keeping promises to your mentee and remaining loyal to those you mentor. Okay, so that's really critical. And, and this is important for students or for junior faculty. When you think about a mentor, you want to be able to find someone who's going to help guide you over the long term, right? In terms of justice, we want to ensure fair and equitable treatment of all mentees, regardless of cultural differences. And this is important because a lot of times labs will have more than one student in the group or mentee. And so, the role of the mentor is to ensure that you have enough time for everyone. And, you need to be transparent, and you want to encourage transparency and open communication regarding expectations. And a lot of times it helps to set up those guidelines, when at the beginning of developing those relationships, how often you should meet, what your lab expectations are, that's really critical. Oops. And other issues that we should really look at are boundaries, avoiding potentially harmful multiple roles with mentees, and discuss overlapping roles to minimize the risk for exploitation or bad outcomes. And I think this is really critical because a lot of times the mentee will be working in their mentor's lab, and so that they're responsible for doing work for their research fellowship. And at the same time, they're responsible for, that mentor is responsible for guiding the mentee's dissertation work. And then, about course selection. And you could see where this could become very convoluted, especially if there aren't clear boundaries. And I know one thing that we've implemented in CNHP is we have a advisor, a faculty advisor for our PhD students, so that if they feel that they have some concerns that they want to raise with someone outside of that mentoring relationship, they're able to do that. So I think that's really important. Privacy is important, that, the mentor needs to protect information shared in confidence by the mentee. But there are situations that we're all bound as faculty, right, in terms of reporting. So we really need to disclose when we cannot keep those exceptions to privacy. And does anybody recall what those might be? Putting people on the spot.
Was the question when you can't keep things private?
Yes.
Confidential. So if somebody was suicidal, that would be an example that they do need to get help.
Yes. Anybody else?
Or if they planned to harm someone else.
Yes. What about any sort of abuse? We're mandatory reporters.
Right. I was just going to say we're all mandatory reporters. So of children specifically.
Mm-hmm. Right. So there are some situations where we need to, there are exceptions to privacy. And it's really important that we all think about establishing and continuing to develop competence in our area of research and science. And that's really important, that we continue to improve in our knowledge. And that's what I think why we're all here today. So next slide. So what I really want to spend time on is talking through this case study. And this is a case study that is adapted from this book, Scientific Integrity, Text and Cases and Responsible Conduct of Research. So next slide. And I'll read it to you, and then we'll give you, we'll spend some time digesting it, and then we'll turn it over to some questions. We'll go through to the discussion questions. So Professor Norma China is planning a research proposal for submission to the National Science Foundation and invites her postdoc, Dr. Eleanor Axelrod, to participate in the writing of the proposal. Dr. China explains to Eleanor that such participation will benefit her in two ways. First, it will provide her with invaluable experience in writing grant applications. And second, if the proposal is approved and funded, the grant will secure 3 more years of training support for her. Eleanor enthusiastically accepts the offer. Dr. China asks her to write a portion of the background section describing results obtained under a previous NSF grant on which Dr. China was the PI. They write independently of one another, but Dr. China does the final editing of the assembled proposal. The proposal is submitted, and Dr. China anticipates that she will learn about its disposition in a few months. However, at about that time, she gets an email from the program officer notifying her that the proposal was administratively withdrawn and will not be considered for funding. The program officer explains that the grant application was found to contain plagiarized material. In particular, the background section contained several paragraphs of narrative that were taken verbatim from a review article published in a peer-reviewed journal. Further, the preliminary results section contained an illustration that appears in a presentation found on the website of another investigator who works in Dr. China's field. It was used in the proposal with only minor modification and without attribution of its source. The program officer also indicates that the NSF Office of Inspector General has been notified of the plagiarism and will investigate. The email is copied to the dean of Dr. China's school. Dr. China realizes that the material in question was written by Eleanor, and she plans to deflect the plagiarism charges by arguing that Eleanor is the culpable party in this case. She plans to claim that it would not be reasonable to expect that she could detect this level of plagiarism in the proposal. She holds that if the allegation results in a conviction, it should be leveled against Eleanor and not her. So, you know what I'm going to try to do is put the discussion questions in the chat so everybody could keep the case study up.
Have them here.
Oh, you got them? Thank you. Super. So why don't we take like maybe, I don't know, 10 minutes to think about this, and then we could come back for discussion. First question is, if you were the dean, how would you respond to these arguments? Second question is, to what extent should mentors be held accountable for trainees' misconduct in such cases? Third question is, what advice do you have for Dr. Chena in terms of how she should deal with Eleanor? And fourth question is, what ethical principles have been violated? So it's 4:19. Maybe we'll come back at 4:30.